In our weekly Ask GMBN Tech Show, we get hundreds and hundreds of questions from you lot. Now, there's always a pattern of certain questions coming up quite frequently, and in the past we've done some commonly asked questions, so here are 5 more commonly asked mountain bike tech questions. Okay, so a really common question actually, and it's a strange question to be a common one, is does it matter which way up my rear shock is? Now, of course, there is a typical way that you would have a shock on a bike, but quite often you do see bikes with the shocks flipped or the abnormal way. So technically on a bit of paper, it will not affect the performance of the shock, which ultimately is what a lot of you are worried about. But you've only got to think that some manufacturers actually spec their bikes with the shocks in a different position to what you would determine as normal. And what I mean by that is, if a shock is in a vertical position on the bike, you would assume that this is the logical position. The main reason for that is you've got the adjusters at the top, which means they're easier to reach whilst you're riding. But some bikes, like Scott Genius for example, the shock actually comes flipped like that or inverted. Now, one of the concerns might be that you'll get mud and water and dirt and stuff on the top of what's effectively the stanchion tube. It's effectively just the same as the suspension fork that's in the same position. And if anything, there's far less to worry about with the shock than there is with the suspension fork. Suspension forks operate at low pressures. The seals on them are quite simple in comparison to these. These actually have 2 rows of seals. They're very tight fitting and the lubrication sits just on the inside here. So actually you get far less of a problem with a shock inverted from that respect than you would with an equivalent suspension fork. And of course, all suspension forks really, apart from some inverted downhill options and the odd single crown, are of course this way up. So that is not a problem. And in case you're wondering why Scott chose to mount theirs this way up, it's because they have a lockout system on their shock, but it's operated by a remote and a handlebars. And otherwise you would have the cables poking out into the middle of the bike and it'd be a right old mess. So they route them down through the down tube and up to the bar. So it's very, very neat and simple. And of course, you don't actually need to access this part of the bike. Once you've set up your air pressure, it's all in place. So it actually makes no difference physically when you're riding the bike, the difference it makes is just in order to facilitate getting to the actual adjusters. Now that is something that is worth talking about. If you fancied flipping the shock on your bike, there are a number of factors you need to take into account. The first one is that there is adequate clearance depending on how the shock is mounted at either end, because you could, under compression, the shocks move and they alter their positions depending if it's a floating mount front and rear, or if it's a single pivot, it moves pretty much just from the rear and will pivot slightly at the front there. Now, you've got to make sure that there's no chance it can foul on any part of your frame, because it will damage your frame and it will damage the shock itself. So there's usually a reason why manufacturers put the shocks in that position. Another thing to factor in is if your shock design has a piggyback reservoir on it. This particular one doesn't, but piggybacks sit down here, and sometimes manufacturers have to flip the shock into a different position in order to allow enough room for where the piggyback sits in the frame. For example, if they wanted to have a water bottle in the frame, or if another particular part of the frame design would clash with it. That's the only reason you see them flipped around. Really, it's all about the convenience of accessing your adjusters. Okay, another question that does come up, which actually I'm surprised a lot of people ask this, is does it matter which gear you store your bike in? Well, there's a few schools of thought on this, and the logical one really would suggest that you store your bike in the highest gear possible. Certainly if you've got a 1x setup, the highest gear meaning you're in the smallest sprocket. So the derailleur is under the least amount of tension possible, and also the cable is under the least tension. However, I don't believe that storing a bike in, say, mid or one of the higher gears will actually affect cable tension, because you use way more cable tension when you're actively changing gear than when a bike is just stored in that setting. And I know for a fact that I've got several bikes in storage that have been, some of them since 2011, literally have not been ridden, and they'll be stored in any random gear. And I'm even tempted to go and get one to prove it. The fact that I can take it out of my loft, I could pump the tyres up, which of course over time do deflate themselves, and prove the fact that the gears still work fine. Now, the spring itself though, that's an interesting point to consider. So the spring, yeah, I guess you could in time, given how much the spring has to actually stretch each time you change gear. If you stored it in that setting, arguably you could be fractionally stretching that spring. But really, with a derailleur on a mountain bike, I would say this is not a concern at all, because you're going to wear out the jockey wheels, you're going to bend the jockey cage, and probably smash the rear mech off long before that ever happens. It might, however, be a consideration on an urban bike, commuter bike, a road bike, something like that. But you'd have to be storing a bike for a pretty long time, I would think, to have that effect. Okay, now here's a classic one. Does storing your bike upright, like in a vertical position, let air into your brake system? No, this is a myth. If you have air in your brakes, this might help expose that fact, but it certainly won't introduce air into your system, especially if your brakes have been bled correctly in the first place. I store all of my bikes vertically at home, some nose up, some tail up, and in our lock-up downstairs and in the workshop, we also store our bikes vertically. There is no problem with this. Now, some brakes are more prone to developing air bubbles in the system than others. There are some problematic brakes on the market. Over time, certain types of brake oil, like DOT oil, can absorb like microscopic amounts of water into the system, which can affect things. And over time, you might find that you do need to bleed your brakes just because of seals perishing and air getting into the system. Now, when you store your bike upright, what you're actually effectively doing is allowing that air to migrate to the top, to your lever end. So if you have got air in your system and you've been storing your bike upright, chances are, put your bike down on the floor, go to fill your brakes, and they might sort of pump, you need to pump them a couple of times before you get to use them. And that's because the air is at that top. Now, if that's something that you have with your own brakes, then really the best thing to do is give them a full system bleed. Bleeding brakes will always remedy this problem. However, if you want a quick, lazy way around this, something that's quite cool and quite easy to do is basically pull your brake lever on and use a tow strap or something similar, cable tie, to hold your brake lever in the locked position. Store your bike upright overnight and those air bubbles will migrate straight to the top there. And at which point you can undo your master cylinder cap on the top and basically get those air bubbles out the system. Now, I've heard of some people doing this before and actually loosening off the bolts there on the top of the lever, on the reservoir there, in order for those air bubbles to migrate out by themselves. And if necessary, you can top up a bit of fluid in there and replace the cap. That's quite a cool way around things, but nothing will beat doing a full system rebleed. Now, it might sound like a daunting thing to do, but it's really, really quite simple. You just need a few specific tools. You're gonna need the oil that's suitable for your brakes. Of course, some brakes have mineral oil and some have DOT oil. You cannot mix them, just get a new fresh one. And also, when you're buying DOT fluid, because of the nature of DOT fluid, over time it can absorb moisture into the fluid itself. It's best to only get enough that you need per bleed, really, because if you have a big container of it, it might cost you less to buy the container per bleed, but it will actually go off in time. Mineral fluid, however, you can buy a big one of those and nothing happens to it. It will not absorb water into the system in the same way. So really, don't be afraid if there's air in your system. Get yourself a bleed kit. There's plenty of places you can get them online. They don't cost a lot of money and really it's a fairly simple process to follow. And a few steps up from bleeding a radiator in a house. Nice and simple, and your brakes will feel fantastic afterwards. Now, this is a classic. Do chains actually stretch? Yes and no. So, they don't stretch in the sense that you would actually think these links become longer and stretched. That just doesn't happen. However, what does happen is the pitch of the chain will stretch slightly. And what happens when that does occur is the fact that your chain, not only is it worn and becomes sloppy, it actually wears other components in your transmission, like the chainring teeth, the troughs, and the actual shape of the teeth profile themselves, and the cassette out back. And of course, when that happens, it means you have to replace them as well as the chain, which is why it's so important to get yourself, even a basic version of one of these, a chain checker. Now, the reason for that is you can monitor the wear and the stretch on your chain and the pitch itself. So as soon as your chain is starting to show signs of wear, you want to be replacing it, because then you won't need to replace the sprockets or the chainring up front. Now, let me just explain the process of this and how it works. So a chain is made up of a few components. So you've got the main links, so these are the outer links, then you've got the inner links, then you have the pins that run through the middle holding them together, and then you have the rollers. So these are the pins, these are the rollers, inner links and the outer links. Now, as part of those inner links, there is actually a bit of a bush system here, so the roller can actually rotate around it, and then the pin goes through the middle, basically holding the whole system together. Now, what happens over time with your chain, especially under high load or lots of miles or really bad weather conditions when you're riding, is the rollers actually develop play as the bush that they rotate on slowly becomes baggy, and effectively everything starts moving internally. So the plates themselves will not grow, but you will get stretch of the chain pitch. Now the chain pitch refers to the length between the two pins. Now the pins is 1/2 inch between them. So basically when you have a chain tool, it will tell you measurements, like this one for example here says new chain is 0.25 to 0.5 and replace it at 0.75. So I would actually go as far as changing it when it's just over 0.5 really. But it does vary on how much money you have and how often you ride in bad conditions, how strong your legs are, a whole number of different factors. But the point is when a chain starts getting baggy, it's not going to connect well with the transmission. It's going to wear out the other components in your transmission. It's not going to shift very well either. This one here has some sort of movement to it, but that gets really accentuated the more worn the chain gets. So technically, yes, a chain does stretch, but no, the links do not actually physically get longer. This one makes me laugh actually, because this is such an obvious question. It is, why is dry lube actually wet? Yeah, okay, so lube's a lube really, are they? No, not so. So you get two main types of lube. Of course, there are loads on the market. You get ceramic lubes, suspension lubes, Teflon lubes, etc. But fundamentally, when it comes to chain lubes, you get a wet lube and you'll get a dry lube. Ultimately, with dry lube, the wet bit of it is just a solvent. So this is effectively a carrier for the lubricating particles in order, when you lube your chain, to make sure that those particles get into the inside of the rollers. That is what you need to lube on a chain. Don't need to lube the plates, don't need to lube anything else, just the rollers. They're the bit that need the lubrication. So ergo, with a dry type lube, you need a solvent in order for it to soak into there, and then the solvent dries up, hence the dry lubricant. Now dry lube actually is very, very good despite the dry name, but the only downside really is the fact that you do need to apply it more frequently because it doesn't have the kind of viscous sort of stickiness to it to keep it in place. Very good for hot, dry conditions. Not so good for wet British conditions, although I actually favour a dry lubricant all year round on most of my bikes just because I'm always cleaning my bikes, I'm always maintaining the transmission, but of course that is not the case with a lot of riders. Now wet lubes clearly are designed for use in wet conditions, and the way it differs to a dry lubricant itself is it has the same lubricating particles except it's in a really thick viscous liquid. Now the idea for this is you can put it on and it stays on a lot longer. It's quite waterproof, some more waterproof than others, which can mean cleaning your chain with wet lubes on, a bit more of a task, and of course it will draw sticky, horrible mess to it. Like if you use this in summer conditions, you'll have dirt and grit all over your transmission. It quickly turns into horrible black sludgy stuff. However, as far as an actual lubricant goes, wet lube is fantastic. So there you go, there's effectively two types of lubricant for different conditions. But if you want to know a bit more about the other types of lubricants out there, and in fact, any sort of assembly compounds, greases, thread locks and stuff like that, check out the video. I'm going to put it in the link below this one. I've got a whole video that tells you exactly where you should be using this sort of stuff, the conditions you should use it and where you should apply it. So there we go. There are some very common maintenance questions that you guys fire into us. If you've got any more questions, let us know in those comments below, or you can send them in to hellotech@gmbn.com, email address on the screen there. For a couple more videos along the same lines, click at the bottom there and you can see both of the previous videos with 5 common maintenance questions. As always, don't forget to give us a huge thumbs up and don't forget to click that subscribe button.